Hello and welcome to this special Martin Luther King Day edition of the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop. Neither Christian nor I were terribly on top of the holiday, but we've decided that MLK was not a fan of paramilitaries, which is what we're discussing today, so we're calling it a go on those grounds. We've got a paper by Beth Altier that we'll be discussing today, Mike Allison, Hannah Birnir, Bridgett Coggins, and Reyko Huang are with us, Christian and myself. Reyko, if you could please get us started.
Okay. Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you, Beth.
You too.
First of all, I really enjoyed the paper. I think it's really well thought out, very clearly written, very well organized. Obviously, tackles a really important topic. Mm-hmm. And I think a very important, timely research question as well. So let me just go through very briefly, perhaps broad, mm-hmm. to the specific of some of the issues or concerns and questions that I had for the paper. First, sort of at the macro level of the paper, I thought that you dealt with some of the endogeneity problems very mm-hmm. thoroughly empirically, but that you could do perhaps a stronger job at that theoretically as well.
Okay.
And so I guess the big question is, does it really make sense to start a story that begins with state violence against an ethnic group when there is a vast literature on the causes of such violence? Right, and you do address this, I think, throughout the paper. So I know mm-hmm. that you're aware of the question. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But state violence is, caused by non-state violence and perhaps other concerns to the state. So mm-hmm. it's probably endogenous to many things mm-hmm. that would matter for your research question. Mm-hmm. And in particular, it could be endogenous to non-state / paramilitary groups' violence. Mm-hmm. So, what's the prior story before the onset of state violence that mm-hmm. causes the security crisis that is the main issue in your story? Mm-hmm. And then I think very much the related question is, why do you choose to focus so much on state violence mm-hmm. As the independent variable? Right. So this is the other part of the endogeneity question. So security crises could arise from violence by other groups, from mm-hmm. other concerns. So if your impetus is to focus on the state violence, I think you should provide a stronger justification for mm-hmm. why that is. Mm-hmm. That is what you choose to do, even at the risk of great endogeneity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I really wanted the backstory of how you actually arrived at this decision to choose, to focus on state violence. Mm-hmm. And then how does the backstory, how might that affect the actual story that you do focus on?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The other question is that the theory about why people would vote for paramilitary parties seems to be all about state violence, like I said. Mm-hmm. But this is actually a story about election outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. So where's the nonviolent politics in this? Mm-hmm. People are voting at the polls. Mm-hmm. Don't they care about what various parties are standing for? So there's very little of the substance of parties' platforms in your story. Mm-hmm. So could these parties just say anything they want, but if there's a security crisis, the paramilitary groups would actually get the votes, mm-hmm. Regardless of what they're saying? Mm-hmm. To what extent do their platforms actually matter? Mm-hmm. And if they do matter, where would you bring it into the story?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Let's see. You treat potential instrumentalism on the part of paramilitary groups as a secondary issue. You sort of address it in the second half of the paper, mm-hmm. sort of a side issue, but it's not a main part of the story. Mm-hmm. But if it is the case that there is instrumentalism involved, as you do point out, mm-hmm. then we do have that backstory problem, mm-hmm. right? Because state violence isn't exogenous. And like you very well point out, paramilitary groups could be provoking the violence against Catholics so that the group can get more votes, right? Mm-hmm. And so, again, how do you incorporate that into your story? Mm-hmm. I think the instrumentalism part really is hard to disregard because the assumption is that these are strategic actors. Right. Okay, and I think I'll make this the last point. You make a really interesting point that when it comes to voting, there is not much coercion involved, at least in the kind of settings that you study in well-established democracies, because the vote is a private matter and the elections are presumed to be generally free and fair, which is a really interesting and great point. But I just wondered if there might be a fear of collective punishment at all if a paramilitary group loses. And so even if the fear is not for the way in which a private individual votes, is there some sort of a collective fear at all? I have no idea, but you probably know. So I'll just leave it at that and turn it over to others.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mary Beth, before you say anything, Bridgett, is it working? Okay. Okay, Mary Beth, responses, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, thanks.
People that want to get on the queue, give me the one finger for new point, two finger for something that you kind of want to add to. Will, is it two to my statement now? Okay.
I can't hear.
Proceed. Oh no, yeah, he's meaning to get on the queue first for a two, but proceed.
So am I going?
Yes, sure.
Will? Oh, okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Reyko. Those were really valuable comments. So just a couple of things. I guess, I agree with you. There definitely is a backstory as to why state violence is occurring. This is obviously, I mean, I don't know if you know, but this paper is part of a larger book project. So even just, as you can tell, I apologize, the paper was so long. Just trying to condense everything down into the paper was very difficult. So I think at this point, I mean, I think maybe in the book manuscript I can delve into that a bit more, and I'm open to suggestions into how to incorporate that into a paper and keep it, short enough to submit. I think, I definitely agree about the instrumentalism and how that ties in. I think what I'm trying to argue, and maybe I can make it a bit more clear, is that, definitely these groups are provoking state violence, but it's the type of violence that the state engages in. This sort of indiscriminate violence against civilians, right? So they can engage in other forms of state violence, right? Maybe more targeted state violence against the paramilitary groups. And so I think I'm trying to make the argument that it's the type of violence that they're engaging in. But I agree completely. There's definitely a whole endogenous story. Everything is going on together. In terms of the party platforms, I actually do look at that in the larger book project, and I'm open to ideas of how to incorporate it here. But what you find during the conflict in Northern Ireland is that most of the parties were talking about the conflict. So, ordinary issues like water charges and things like that weren't really being discussed in the platforms, except for the sort of civic parties like Alliance. And I mean, what you do see though is that, so I've gone through all of the party manifestos, and you see groups like Sinn Féin constantly sort of harping on the security issue. So they are sort of, using that to their advantage. And I do talk about that in the book. I don't know if it's worth putting into this here. And this idea of collective punishment, I agree completely. I haven't seen any evidence of it. I actually have a footnote in the paper on it, but I haven't seen any evidence of it. But it's something I'm sort of, aware of, and have looked for. But I haven't seen any, evidence that it occurs, at least in Northern Ireland.
Otherwise, good. You're open now. Mary Beth, you done?
Yep. Yeah. Thank you.
Hannah, go ahead.
I think my comments are a little bit different. So I sort of wrote comments as if, I was going to be talking for a little bit. So I don't know whether you I just want a clarification. Should I just send those to Mary Beth, or should I actually sort of go through them here, or are you envisioning more of a conversation, or?
It's definitely conversational, but given the kind of Bridgett debacles thing, communication issue initially, you could do like one or two.
Okay.
And then we'll kind of go more interactive.
Okay, so I'll just do a few, and then you can just stop me if you think I'm going on too long.
I'll have no problem trying to
I
stop.
know you won't have any problem.
Trying to stop. Yeah.
Well, Mary Beth, it's really I really enjoyed the paper. It's really nice to get a chance to comment on it. I think this was the paper we were trying to connect over at APSA.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to get a chance to sit down and read it and give you some comments.
Thanks. Thank you.
I really, really like the project. I just want to start by saying I think that you're absolutely right. There are very few projects out there that are looking at civilians' motivations in elections when it comes to these types of parties, what motivates them, who they vote for, why, and that kind of thing. So I think this is an excellent project, and you've clearly done a lot of research, really important new data collections there. I know it's very difficult to get the election results from Northern Ireland. They're not readily available, and so all of the collection that you've done to put that together, that's very impressive, and it's going to be really useful. I think that the paper, as it is right now, you can tell that it's a book project. There's a lot in it, and so I think one of the challenges is to sort of distill exactly what you want to say in the paper. And so I hope that some of my comments help with that. And the first thing I want to sort of start with to maybe think about how you might go about sort of clarifying a central puzzle or some central point that you can get through in this paper. I want to talk about the framing of the paper. So the way that you're getting at this topic right now, as I was reading it in the paper, you're sort of you're coming at it from the aggregate literature. And you're going over all of these different literatures that say something about how voters should, or what you should expect voters to do in various situations when there is civil conflict. And you sort of make the point that nobody is talking about how civilians are actually responding to the violence and how that motivates them or doesn't motivate them. And you sort of make the case that this is just entirely absent from the literature. At the same time, you do cite some authors that focus on single cases, Aliter, for example, and De La Calle and Sanchez Cuenca. And knowing those cases, you also know that there's a lot of literature actually, particularly sort of case analyses and qualitative analysis, that talks about precisely the types of things that you're discussing in the paper. The fact that civilians are motivated by the violence that's occurring in the local context, and who perpetrates the violence makes a big difference, and against whom also. And so I think perhaps instead of just sort of getting at this topic from the aggregate literature and saying, well, nobody's really looking at this, I think maybe it would be useful to juxtapose the aggregate literature and the case literature and saying, well, actually it's not right that nobody is pointing out this security dilemma, or this security concern. Lots of people are. They're just not doing it in an aggregate sort of cross-national context. So within the case of Northern Ireland, for instance, you know, I've had long conversations with O'Leary about precisely this, how Sinn Féin and the IRA more generally are very concerned about who's perpetrating violence in Catholic communities and how they administer violence and so forth, because they're very much aware of the fact that their violence against the Catholics, as well as security forces' violence against the Catholics, affects every political activity that the civilians then engage in. So I think that maybe it's more of a qualitative account where we do see this story, and we're not seeing it in the aggregate cross-national studies. And having said that, I also think that you have something of an interesting local puzzle that might also be used to motivate the story here. And there's this seeming contradiction in the paper where you talk about how Sinn Féin, they started out with a low level of the vote or low proportion of the vote, and then it increases over time.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, at a different point in the paper, you talk about how there was sort of this pent-up demand for their vote when they first came onto the electoral scene. And I think that sort of thinking about their vote and their vote share a little bit in the context of the story might give you sort of an interesting puzzle. And I think that is the fact that even when, actually at the same time that security force killings of Catholics were decreasing, the vote share of the Sinn Féin was increasing. And if the qualitative accounts that Sinn Féin vote share should be increasing as security force killings are increasing is correct, this is a puzzle. But the way to explain that is by this district level analysis show that it's correct that Sinn Féin vote is going up for everywhere for reasons related to the platform. You talk about how they became more conciliatory and so on and so forth. Even so, even accounting for the fact that their vote is increasing everywhere, it increases, I'm assuming, given your statistical analysis, more in regions where there still is some killing. So you have sort of a, you could say, you could juxtapose the aggregate literature with the local literature and then say, well, still the local literature can't really give me a handle on this puzzle. I can explain this puzzle to you because I'm looking at the district level results in relation to killing. So that's sort of how I would go about framing the paper, and I think that might help you cut down on some of the extra material or sort of make decisions about where you could cut.
Let me stop you there for a second. Okay, so Mike, you had a 2. Was that on what Hannah was saying? You wanted to add to it, or was that slightly different? Will had a 2, but that was before Hannah said anything, so it couldn't have been related.
I'd say it was probably a little bit more to what Hannah was talking about in terms of the literature.
Okay, add that in, and then we'll go to Mary Beth.
Okay. I really enjoyed the paper. I thought one of its main contributions was about looking at the performance of Sinn Féin or a paramilitary party while a conflict was going on. But I didn't know if you want to think about it. There's been a lot of work in the last several years about post-war elections. So the transition of former military or armed groups to political parties. Trying to think about how the legacy of the war, the legacy of the conflict in terms of violence affects the performance of these groups as they've transitioned into entity. And in that sense, it's a lot that's written about, like rebel groups to political parties, revolutionary groups, there's terrorists to political parties. And so I was thinking that it's another area where there has been a lot of work to link violence and the vote. And I was leading to think about where do paramilitaries fall, or paramilitary parties fall when we're talking about these diverse armed groups. One of your footnotes, or footnote 1, you talk about whether or not the difference is there for future research. But I wanted to see where these paramilitary parties fit within the broader literature on armed groups, and whether or not the discussion of these groups in the case of Northern Ireland is rather unique to Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to respond, or?
He appeared to trail off at that point in time, which led me to believe that his intervention was...
Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, this is something like...
My decision or Christians.
Okay.
Respond away.
I mean, this is something I really struggle with, and even this word paramilitary, because when I've presented this to Latin Americanists, they have a very different idea of what paramilitary is than in the context of Northern Ireland. So, I mean, I've thought about just using the word armed parties, but I really want some sort of level of organization, outside the institutions of the state. And so I sort of try to distinguish these parties from groups like the BJP, which sort of co-opt the state or sort of foment violence but don't actually arm themselves. So that's sort of the distinction I'm trying to make. I don't know, again, I think that's sort of a sort of path for future research, seeing whether this would apply to sort of more disparate groups. But I mean, in thinking about it, when I think about a party like the BJP, for me, it's not necessarily always clear, or it may not. I don't know the case well enough, but it may not necessarily always be clear to the citizens, how the group is using violence or fomenting violence. Where with a group like, or a party like Sinn Féin, they clearly know that the IRA is there. They have a clear sort of tie to violence. And so in thinking about how violence affects citizens' voting preferences, I'm concerned that there might be some difference in sort of the attribution of violence by the party or its connections to violence, which is why at this point I make that distinction. That makes sense? I don't know.
Okay. Given the format, the rhetorical nature of the question is occasionally not always helpful, but because people click and so forth. Let's quickly go to Will, and then we'll come back. Bridgett, were you finishing typing your question, or you're just going to chill? And yes, Will, go ahead. Oh,
there's a question there popped up. Okay, how does it look?
We'll get to that after. Will first, yes.
I want to just touch briefly on one of the things that Reyko brought up, Mary Beth, and that is I don't know if you've seen Abby Steele's 2011 article in JCR, but the issue that Reyko raised was collective punishment, and her paper is about how parties did use collective punishment. I believe it was Columbia, and in fact would use collective punishment after the fact, and effectively redistribute housing. And so, to the extent that it seems to me that you just want to address that, and to the extent that that's not, collective punishment was not an issue in Northern Ireland, then that's not an issue for you. But I just wanted to, if you weren't familiar with the paper, make sure you're aware of it and encourage you.
Great.
Okay, so because our viewers cannot hear or read Bridgett, I'll read it aloud, and then if you address what you can. So how is the security crisis distinct from a lack of trust? Why no voting on the unionist paramilitary side? How important is the change in Sinn Féin, its moderation as compared to the violence? Voter memories are short, elections are few and far between. What about the year prior to that? And we'll kind of let you deal with those first, and then go from there.
All right. So how is the security crisis distinct from lack of trust? I'm not sure. That's a good question. I mean, I kind of think of it in almost the same way, right? So lack of trust that the government, can or will protect you from violence. I'm not sure. I'm open to any suggestions there, but I'm not sure. I would need to think about that a little bit. I'm not sure what the exact question was about unionist paramilitary parties, but there were actually unionist paramilitary parties, so I have that in a chapter of the book manuscript, and I find that the same, as state violence against Protestant civilians and sectarian, but same patterns hold, although those parties receive much less support. And I also have a chapter in the book manuscript talking about why those parties receive less support and why there's less support on the unionist side. I'm not sure what the exact question is about unionist paramilitaries, because I can't hear or see it, but that's sort of how I deal with them. Let's see. Voters have a short memory. I agree. But I think what I'm trying to get at with the state violence, and I think this gets to Reyko's earlier point about why I focus on state violence, and I don't think I'm clear enough about this in the paper, is that it's just sort of one proxy for the security crisis. So, I make all these arguments about how changes in state policy affect citizens' perceptions of their security. So there are these huge sort of macro level policies, right, sort of emergency legislation and other things that also affect their perceptions of their security at the aggregate level. And what I'm trying to get at here is, at the sort of local level, and I use state violence just as a proxy. So it's one way right? It's a very visible way in which citizens, experience or update their beliefs about the state, right? And whether they can, I guess, trust the state, if I want to use that term. So again, it's not necessarily the one death that affects people's preferences, and when they go to the polls, they think about that one death. It's just that it's sort of, is an event that will, shape their perceptions of the state, and it also is proxying for other, right? So I couldn't get data on sort of injuries or low-level violence for this period. So what I sort of implicitly made the assumption that, where these deaths are occurring, there's also low-level violence and other things occurring, which I think also gets to your comment, Reyko. I just couldn't measure all of that low-level violence that is going on in those neighborhoods. Let's see. And I don't know what the comment is about the year prior to. I don't know what Bridgett, can you hear me? I can't hear you, but I don't know what the comment. Christian, maybe you know what was the year prior?
I believe she can hear, so she can type that clarification. So we'll allow that point to be clarified. She'll busily type. My quick two concerned one click. Oh, so she goes, why aggregated over several years?
Okay, so are you talking about the voting, the violence data? Okay, yeah. So because I'm looking at what I'm trying to get at is changes in their vote share as my dependent variables. So I'm aggregating, right, the violence over several years and looking at the effect of that on the change in their vote share. So I don't have a measure for the years in between of their vote share. So I can't test sort of at a more, each year I wouldn't have a measure of their electoral preferences. I don't know if that makes sense. Oh, I can't hear. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, one way I sort of want to think about the data is, to create, the way the data is arranged now, it's not really a time series, it's more of a panel data set, but to actually create a time series where I could see if attacks closer to the election have a larger effect, but that would be, at this point, it's going to be very time intensive to do that.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my two concern some of the violence. So the project I have with Cyan Loyal and Chris Sullivan, we have the disaggregated data, but part of it is there's 4 actors, and you don't really discuss all 4. And so part of my thing is, how does the interaction between the 4 actors influence the electoral behavior when the electoral discussion seems to be a discussion of two actors, effectively. So I'm wondering how you're aggregating and so forth. And then I'm wondering what you get from kind of, if you put the violent behavior into a sequence, I'm wondering if that has different electoral implications. And if you were just aggregating of what happened over n number of periods without capturing the sequence, I'm wondering if that would mean the same things as you approach the election.
Okay. So just to be clear, which 4 actors are you?
Loyalists, Republicans, the Northern Irish government, and the British government.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So again, I tested. For instance, I broke. I think in the paper I do test the different types, right, of loyalist violence and things like that. Are you talking sort of more at the aggregate level or at the local level?
I'm talking about lumping all the violence together, as opposed to separating out exactly who did what at what period of time as you're approaching the election. Yeah, I'm just talking about getting a sequence prior to election.
Okay.
Hannah had a 2.
Yeah, I have a 2 on this one, and this is actually one of the things that I found confusing in the paper, and I think that it would be very helpful if you talked more about the actors, because as Chris was saying, there are different actors. There's the Catholics and the Protestants, and then there's Sinn Féin. There's paramilitaries on the Protestant side, and then there are and then there's then there are the British forces, and presumably the security dilemma doesn't apply to all. And so when security forces are killing Catholics, it's not a security dilemma for the Protestants and so forth. Although you do at some point talk about how any killing increases security dilemma in either community. And if that's something that you think, then it would be helpful if we understood that at the outset. If you laid out the theory, here are the actors, here is how I expect whatever happens to influence how they are going to then behave. I think that would be very helpful. If I may, a two-finger also on the empirics. I had a hard time understanding the cross-sectional. What cross-sectional of what is that? Is that what election?
Those are local elections.
Yeah, but what year? Because you were talking about several different local elections.
So it's 1985 to 2001, I believe.
But are you looking at that's what I don't understand.
It's 5 local election years across, I think it's 101 districts.
So are you putting together all election results so from every single year into that single regression?
Yeah, and then I run fixed. So then I control for each election year using fixed effects. The cross-sectional one, not the first differences.
Yeah, the cross-sectional one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so I use fixed effects there, and I have district level effects and things like that.
This might help. Is the N 110 or 550?
I need to look at my charts. It would be the.
There's not one observation per district, right? You have cross section of district election year.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So what happens is the number of observations drops because I'm only looking at district Sinn Féin contests, right? So let's see. Let me look. Put my chart here. Here we are. Yeah, so it's 270.
But then presumably, if you have an aggregate count of deaths, you are suggesting that some deaths that occurred after an election had an effect on that election outcome. That doesn't.
I'm confused. I don't see where aggregate.
I don't know. That's why I don't understand the structure of the data. So if you have all electoral districts from 80-something to 90-something in one cross-section, and you have one measure of killings for each of these groups per that district, then presumably that accounts for killings that occurred through that entire period.
No, so what I do is I look at the number of deaths that occur between elections. So for instance, let's say between the previous local election and the current one that we're measuring, how many deaths occurred in that district of a certain type. So let's say 4, right? So something like that.
Okay, and so the way that the structure is. Okay, let me think about that for a little bit.
Okay, all right. But definitely, I could be clear.
We're now on my 2, or on my 1. Is it okay if I jump in?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So Mary Beth, I think that your unit of observation is the you could call it the election district, right? And it and temporally it begins after an election, and it runs through the next election. You count up all the deaths per district, which if you say per district, because I wanted, my one finger was going to say, are your deaths national or are they per district, right? It was unclear from the text, to me anyway, and it might have been sloppy reading on my part, but one of the things we want to try and do is make it hard for readers to read poorly.
Yeah,
right? So whether it's just missing or you need to put it in more flashing neon, that just wasn't clear to me. And apparently not to Hannah as well, right? So that's a big deal that people actually understand understand the data structure. And then I'll follow up in a little bit just because you haven't really had a chance to respond to some of the other things. But I'm going to ask questions about missing this across all this. But we'll put that off till you've had a chance to respond to this other stuff.
Okay. Yeah, Yeah, so it's definitely per district. I think Will explained it better than I, so I'll add some signposting in there. I don't know. I mean, in terms of sequencing, Christian, I think that's a really interesting idea. I'm just not sure how to measure it for that many districts, and to show that. I'm open to any and all suggestions, but showing the sequence of the violence and how if are you talking at the micro local level or? Can't hear. I can't hear you. I can't. I couldn't hear.
Yeah, no, same here. I don't know what happened, Chris. You're muted now. You were unmuted, but we couldn't hear you.
I'm trying.
Oh, you're good now. You were good. Today is just going to be an audio day for us. Why don't I take over and I'll try and take a guess. I think I might know where Chris was going in some respect, Mary Beth, and that is you do break down whether how many deaths are attributed to how many deaths occur within a particular group that are attributed to a particular actor, but it's not the complete set. So that's one possibility. So I think he was making two different points. That is, if we actually drew all the dyads, you don't have them all, right?
Okay.
So you have some of them, and then you have a lot of them actually, but you do aggregate over that, and it connects back to what Bridgett was saying. You do aggregate over that whole period, which doesn't have any. What that takes away is our sense of any relative responses across these different groups in the conflict. You could argue that, yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think the strongest response for you would be that if you think theoretically it's just not relevant, right? That this is about whether or not people feel secure, and whether or not they feel secure is not a relative judgment about one actor's level of violence given another actor's level of violence. It's just, so I don't know. I'm not entirely sure I've characterized Christian well, but I think that's where sort of where he was going.
You hear me now?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. So Will got power to me as always, but Jesus. You still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, this thing says I'm muted now, so I have no idea.
I can hear you.
Okay, but my thing was that participating in an election is actually kind of a statement about kind of like organized and sanctioned political behavior, and thus the sequence of the different actors' behaviors leading up to the election might inform the individual citizen's kind of action, because at a certain part, I thought you were kind of making the analogous statement of kind of civilian defection in Civil War context to kind of narc on one side as opposed to the other was analogous to throwing your vote in one direction or the other. But the election is sanctioned by the state, and thus that's a very different statement than civilian defection in a Civil War context when they're just narking on somebody, which you can do in a way that's not necessarily part of an officially sanctioned type of behavior. So that's what I thought the sequence let you get at. Will kind of like operationalize sequences in an earlier piece, which kind of got at the different turns. But even his thing didn't necessarily capture the number of turns before an election. So basically, you might recode the electoral period to kind of get at, okay, it's mostly if basically the Brits are doing everything, and then right before the election, then the IRA and then paramilitaries kick on. I think that should be very different from a period where it's paramilitaries going back and forth with the Brits, and then the Irish government kicks in, and then there's something. by the IRA. So I think the sequence lets you get at some important variation of what you expect people to do prior to participating in an election. And it's kind of, for me, I thought it was kind of strange to not talk about the literature on what informs people's voting behavior. We now know a lot about that, and put that argument into the context of conflict literature, because I thought that was kind of like, I'm like, well, what would you be thinking about? And I think that would actually get you to the sequence a little bit. That gets into what's really cool about this case and what's really cool about the variation. Because for me, it's kind of, the framing was kind of like, there's a paramilitary literature, and there's ethnic conflict and violence literature, and there's kind of ethnic conflict and democracy literature. And then you hint at the voting behavior literature, and you hint at the Civil War defection literature, and I'm like, that's way too many literatures for us. But I was like, you needed to bring those together for me a little bit clearer. Hannah had.
I was just going to say, bringing in the voting literature, I think one of the reasons I was confused is because if you have a panel, then at the very least you would want to control for the prior share of the vote of the party, because that's generally the strongest predictor of the current share of the vote that the party is going to get. And so I think that would be something useful. And I think the institutional literature, there's a confusion, I think, if I may, because we're talking about the voting literature. So you mentioned the institutional literature a little bit, and there are actually two different arguments in the institutional literature. There's the Horowitz argument, and then there's the Wilkinson argument. And the Horowitz argument, because you talk about the district structure, the Horowitz argument is actually that where demographics are such that you have equal size ethnic groups in a district, then he actually expects there to be less conflict, because what politicians will do is they will try to appeal to both ethnic groups in order to get elected, because they can't appeal to one, they can't outbid it essentially, because then they won't get elected. Wilkinson is making a different argument. Wilkinson is not talking about outbidding when there are two ethnic. He's talking about a situation where you have outbidding between two parties that are representing the same ethnic group. So the BJP and the Congress, for example, they both represent Hindus, and they outbid against the Muslims, not because they're in electoral competition with the Muslims, but because they're in electoral competition with each other, and so they outbid against. So the electoral competition is actually within an ethnic group. So when you have high electoral competition within an ethnic group, then you get outbidding against another minority group. So I think that's something that you need to go back to in the paper and change the discussion on that. And there was another voting comment that I had, but I'll come back to that later.
Bridgett has a 2, so you type it.
Is it about PR? Yeah, so it is a PR system. If that's, I'm assuming she means proportional representation.
And O'Leary.
Puerto Rico, so it's like, all right.
Yeah, Brendan O'Leary actually has written a lot about the single non-transferable vote in Northern Ireland. So, and there's a whole debate about that between Horowitz and no, that's not about the alternative vote. But anyway, there's a large debate about the single non-transferable vote versus the majoritarian, more majoritarian systems.
Reyko, you're muted. Common problem in the group. Yes.
Sorry about that. Am I on? Okay, so just to add to this conversation, I think in my head, in terms of organizing where your paper would fit into the broader literature, I just wanted a clear understanding of. So you say, well, this is the case of Northern Ireland. It's voting for paramilitary political parties. Whatever we find in your study would be very helpful in informing our understanding of parties like Hezbollah and Hamas and other political paramilitary parties in developing countries. But is it really the application to the developing countries that that best situates your paper, or is it the question of, so I think this was just mentioned by Hannah, is it more, the question of what is the difference between voting in democracies where you have the paramilitary option? So what is the baseline? And the baseline you seem to suggest is voting for paramilitary parties wherever they exist, including in the developing world. That's sort of the reference that you kept on bringing up throughout the paper. But is that really the appropriate or the most useful reference if we wanted to draw broader implications from your study? Or do we want to be able to say, well, this is a study of elections, and this is how things are different when you have a security crisis, or when you have the paramilitary option, or when political parties are armed? So again, I think this goes back to the framing question, and I really like papers that draw in a lot of different literatures together, but I think it'd be helpful to maybe have a clearer statement of where you think best, your study best fits in the broader setup.
Okay.
And I think this also goes back to someone else's claim about, well, how do we locate paramilitary parties as you define them in the spectrum from rebel group to peaceful political party?
So my two to that. I'm also a fan of kind of integrating multiple literatures in one spot, but I think that the article format kind of militates against that type of activity, because then you end up giving short shrift to the different literatures, and anyone who knows those different literatures is going to attack you for giving their stuff short shrift, and so it seems more booky than it is article appropriate. Related to that, I'm of course going to lay on something else, but so Powell in Elections as Instruments of Democracy makes the point that basically when people are going to the ballot box, they're not thinking about many of the things that you're saying that they're thinking about, so you need to kind of address that. And then Mitchell's work kind of shows that Democratic leaders are even very good about obscuring accountability or the connection between violence and the vote. So I think there's an interesting tension. I'm with you. I don't. Hannah's one of my dearest friends, and she knows I hate electoral politics. So the minute she started to do this kind of conflict and voting thing, I'm just like, ho hum. I have no interest in it. I think there is a connection. Her paper with Anita shows me that there is a connection. My interest in democratic institutions as also engaging in violence pushes it in another direction. I think there is a connection, but at the same time, I'm like, for me, it's like, okay, electoral politics is this theatrical performance which comes with it a bunch of kind of presumptions and understandings and willingness to kind of follow certain rules. Conflict is, by definition, against a lot of these rules. So for me, I didn't quite get over the tension between these two very distinct literatures that I think are related, but I wasn't quite buying it. I'm just like, why are people voting at all? I mean, what's the percentage of the population that could vote that is voting in the election, and why the hell would you vote when people are getting stuff blown up? And so I was kind of like, I wasn't quite getting the meaning of the vote in the conflict context, and that meaning for me is kind of fleshed out, because I'm just like, well, does the vote mean the same thing in a conflict situation? What is your belief about what happens afterwards? What are you trying to signal? And so some of that was kind of lost for me in a conflict where activities and spaces and all these things are so pregnant with meaning. I mean, like what the mural says now. I mean, so it's like, so for me, I was kind of like trying to get at that tension, and I wasn't quite there, but kind of spoke to kind of Reyko's comment that I hope I didn't distract from, but it kind of made me think about that as well. Quick response before moving to Bridgett.
Okay. So am I responding? Is that?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So no, I agree. I mean, this is one of the hardest things, and I have looked at the voting literature, again, in the book manuscript or dissertation, but and one of the things I'm struggling with, so maybe at the end of this you can all help me, is just how to condense this and into an article format, and all of your suggestions are great, and I'm hoping to incorporate them into the book and maybe the paper, but I just don't know how to to get the paper to 30 pages and out with all of this information. But I agree. So my struggle with the voting is, and you actually do see that. I mean, I think from what I've seen in Northern Ireland is it gives people a voice, right? It gives them a chance to sort of express themselves and their preferences, and it also gives them representation. So beginning in the 80s, right, Sinn Féin was serving in on boards. It's not like you were voting for them and then they were not taking their seats or something like that. So I do think that the two can in some ways mesh together. But I guess one of the things I was struggling with the voting literature is that absent, I mean, I've done interviews, but absent any, really great survey data, and again, people aren't going to be like, now this is a historical case, but also people aren't going to be like, oh, I voted for Sinn Féin, and then also why. So it's really hard for me to get at, individual sort of motivations for voting for the party in a representative way. So that's something that I'm really struggling with. So sort of what are the mechanisms by which violence is actually affecting the preferences. So I try to outline some of the mechanisms of things I saw through archival research and things like that, but it's really hard for me to get at that, in a representative way. Are they voting sort of retrospectively, prospectively? And again, I'm struggling with that. I don't know if there's anything else to respond to here.
Bridget's thing seemed more like a clarification. So Bridgett, am I good in moving? Okay, well.
You can't hear.
Right now, I was struggling with my mouse to unmute. Sorry about that. So I have a few different suggestions for freeing up some space, moving some things around, and since you raised that, I thought I'd jump in. The first thing. So I'm going to hit three things. So the first thing is I found Figure 1 very confusing, and I don't think I would cut it. You can go ahead and poll the others and see if anybody found it useful. The discussion on pages 14 to 16 that surround did I say Figure 3? I apologize. I meant Figure 1. But the discussion on pages 14 to 16 that surround that figure, it's actually presented after the hypotheses, and yet it strikes me as an explanation to motivate the hypotheses. So, and I was actually pretty content after the hypotheses, and so I was actually wondering, do you want to just cut that completely? Okay. I would definitely cut the figure. And then I would move any of the discussion surrounding that on 14 through 16 integrated into motivating the hypotheses or let it go. You can't, right, a book manuscript just has a completely different length and there's just more you can say. You can't cram stuff in. So somehow you ended up feeling like you could leave that out for your hypothesis development in writing it, and I would encourage you to see, can you just leave it out completely and let that detail be in the book. I thought, let's see, my note is not that clear. The discussion on pages 32, 33, well, I'll just lie. I won't take up our time looking through it, but I thought that discussion could move to an appendix and rather than be in the text. And I also, when you get to on pages 33 to 35, the predicted versus the actual, to me that came out of nowhere. I wasn't thinking, boy, I want to see that, and you hadn't given us many signposts, or at least not that I picked up that it was going to be there. And so that struck me also as that's nice, but I don't know that it really adds anything. Why not either just leave it in the book or move it to an appendix? And then finally, I'm going to call them qualitative vignettes, but that's only because I never know what the heck to call these things. Right? I mean, they're not detailed case studies. Anybody who wants to accuse you of, well, you already knew your findings, and then you went through and you cherry-picked from all the histories and case studies that you've read, which undoubtedly are many, the things that were consistent with, right? And you know, I'm not saying you did that, but how do you demonstrate you didn't do that? You know, you can't. And so if a critic wants to feel that way, they can. What I would encourage you to do is move that prior to the hypotheses. I always found, I don't know if anybody reads it anymore, Eckstein from way back in the 60s had this hypothesis-generating case study idea. And I thought those, you know, not the full 10 pages, but some subset of those cases could really work nice prior to the hypothesis development. And I thought they would work really well there. So those would be my suggestions for shifting a few things around, trying to free up some space, and you know, get it into an article length that you could submit.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm with you on I'm with you on the figure. The minute I saw it, I'm just like, oh, there's going to be structural equation modeling or some computer simulation, and I'm just like, upon not seeing it, I'm just like, I felt betrayed.
Sorry.
Q is open.
Can I?
Return to you, Adams. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I sort of want to second what Will was saying about the qualitative, and also what Mary Beth was saying about the qualitative vignettes, the use of them. I think that the Northern Irish case is different from many cases because there is so much qualitative analysis of it, and so you have undoubtedly read the bulk of it, and so you can just tell us what the trends are. And I don't think that, I mean, you can tell us, by and large, the qualitative scholars think that X, Y, and Z, that this is something that motivates, and then you can, you know, list them. And I think that they are, by and large, saying that the security situation, who's killing whom and when, affects the way that people think about both violent politics and nonviolent politics. And you do say at some point in the paper that you know, this gives people voice, or this is something that you know, this is a way for people to act that maybe they can't act in any other way. Not everybody can go and fight. Not everybody is a part of these militia groups and paramilitary groups. And so I think that just stating that as a part of your theory and backing that up with some of these qualitative this qualitative evidence is very convincing, because I think there is a sense it's not like there are 2-3 case studies on Northern Ireland. I mean, there are volumes and volumes that have been written, and a lot of people have taken a lot of interviews and lived through it, and so on and so forth. So I think that you can use the case material more strongly, and it sort of echoes what Will was saying. Instead of putting it all at the end, weaving it through the text as you are building the case for your hypothesis, I think would be a much better way of doing that, and a much more convincing way of doing that.
Thanks. That's great.
Mike, you had it too.
Yeah, it was. I guess a little bit ways thinking about the Northern Ireland conflict again compared to other conflicts, but focusing on Northern Ireland, that in the districts that you're looking at where it's state security forces, the British and the Northern Ireland forces, who kill Catholic civilians, it looks like the maximum that you have in a single 4-year period in a single 6. And that's the Northern Ireland conflict, right? We're taking 3 people killed over a 25-30 year period. In that sense, a single killing is very traumatic. 6 killings is very traumatic, and that it does give some credibility to the strong empirical findings that you have on the impact of a single on people's voter preferences. But I think, you know, like, I think you can make you have to explain to us how even 1, 2, or 3 killings over a 4-year period will have such a strong effect. Something maybe about the small population in Northern Ireland. Again, we're talking 2 million people, less.
Yeah.
And
these districts are very small too, so
very small. The very close knit connection of ethnic groups in the country that you will know who died. You will know who killed your security force or a paramilitary. Because the expectations are different for who killed them, right? I think even a little bit in there just to say that this is something in Northern Ireland where 1, 2, or 3 people killed over a 4-year period. We have a good belief or a strong belief that we will recognize this in citizens' voter preferences. If we get to a conflict where whether it's Colombia or El Salvador or any other place in the world, 1, 2, 3 killings in a district over a 4-year period, I don't think you're going to have the same expectation to affect voter preferences. Which led into you have it so far, right?
I'm losing. My video is breaking up. I don't know.
Well, for me then how would you measure the security crisis if we move to another conflict, right? And the security crisis here was that a single killing, a couple of killings by the security forces of the civilians is what leads people to change their vote, to go from a nonviolent political party to a paramilitary political party. We still would we expect it's based upon the single killing or a handful of killing of individuals, or I guess in that sense you'd be looking at other measures of state repression, state terror.
I can't. Mike's video is cutting out. I can't hear.
Yeah, Mike, can you repeat that one more time?
For which one?
Sorry,
I'll just focus on Northern Ireland. I think you can do somewhere in the paper when you fix it up to send out if it's in an article format, just to give us greater confidence that a single killing, a handful of killings over a 4-year period will affect people's vote choices, given the peculiar nature, perhaps, of Northern Ireland. Small population, concentrated ethnic groups, the idea that everyone will know who killed whom.
Mary Beth, I'm hearing clearly. Are you not hearing him?
I heard him on that one.
Can you repeat it, Christian? Because it doesn't look like Mary Beth's hearing him.
I couldn't hear Mike at all. It was cutting out.
Oh, interesting.
It was just very slow. I couldn't.
Can you hear me?
Repeat it.
Mary Beth, can you hear me? Okay, I'm unmuted. Mary Beth, can you hear?
Yeah.
Mary Beth, can you hear Will?
Yeah, I see Will. I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening.
Mary Beth, can you hear me?
It's cutting out. I don't know.
This would be interesting. We've never had the paper being presented and that hearing fell out. Okay, so since this thing is being recorded, we could just say everything and then she could play it back and then potentially hear that.
That's true. I was able to hear Mike fine.
I was as well. Okay, so for the future, Mary Beth, when you're hearing this, we're now going to continue the conversation with the presumption that you could hear the tape back, and then you'll get all the comments that way. Reyko, why don't you start speaking, and then I'll type to her what it is we just decided to do.
Reyko, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. I heard Mike pretty well, and that was a really useful comment for me because it actually answers some of the questions that I had about the empirical part, which is that I also noticed that the N of the violence categories were very small. Can you hear me?
No, everybody's cutting out. I don't know, maybe if I sign off and sign back in. Can you hear me?
Is everyone else hearing me okay?
Okay. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's fine. You guys, you keep going. Can you hear me?
Reyko, we're hearing you fine.
Okay.
Okay.
And you categorize the violence into 4 categories, each of which has a very small n. And so I think Mike's comment really did a good job addressing that, to say that each incident is really consequential in the case of Northern Ireland. But I thought perhaps even just a footnote, this is a minor comment, even a footnote to say that that categorization is accurate would be helpful, because I was wondering if it's such a small n and there are 4 parts to the violence, then the measure would have to be pretty good for it to be a good reflection of what's going on. And then just to, if I may, tag on to Will's earlier comment.
You may.
I also agree with Will that the longish discussion after the hypotheses threw me off a little bit, because I wasn't sure what they were. But then I figured out that they were it was an elaboration of why a security crisis would increase the votes for paramilitary groups. I agree that that section could be condensed quite a bit. I think it should still be there as an explanation of your potential causal mechanisms, but I think it could be condensed quite a bit. But leading up to the hypothesis, as I said in my first comment, I think you could do a lot more to explain why there is a focus on state behavior and state violence. So a little bit more to motivate the hypotheses, and perhaps a little bit less following the hypotheses, I think would probably make a bit more sense.
Related to that, I was wondering, in all likelihood, and many people have already kind of like investigated the fact that the different forms of violence that you have in there are related to one another. So I'm wondering if you've played out kind of interactions and kind of like dynamic processes, because clearly they're affecting one another, but right now their model is being independent effects, which is kind of problematic.
Do you want me to respond
to that?
Or no?
Sure.
Go ahead, Hannah. Do you want to go? Or?
Oh, I was just going to ask, related to that, have you tried looking at, because you're talking about a security environment, and at some point you make the case that the security environment is not just the security forces, but whatever is happening in the environment. And so I was wondering if you tried to aggregate some of those and what the results were from that. And then I just wanted to make a brief two-finger on Mike's previous point about generalizability, which I thought was really important. At some point in the paper, you say that you are looking at subnational units because some of the aggregate literature has done so. But I don't think that you can actually do this kind of study in any other way, because the context is so different in each case that when you're thinking about generalizability, you have to think about the context that Mike was talking about. In Northern Ireland, a killing might mean something. In other contexts, a single killing might not mean anything. And the political parties are going to be different, and the institutional environment is going to be different, and so forth. And so I think you have a really strong case for studying this process subnationally. The one thing I didn't find was any explanation of why you were looking at local elections as opposed to their Wiltshire national elections, because those you can get district level results for that too. So
Mike, too, to hopefully you're taking the notes to kind of keep, as the twos concatenate, it then becomes something else. But so I just want to it's not a question, it's not a comment, it is a concern I have of those of us doing subnational work, where effectively it becomes this really great idiosyncratic study of this thing that's over there that relates to nothing else. And so this is our tension, right? It's just like we can get better and closer with the causal mechanisms, but then we're losing our ability to speak to all these other cases. And the minute a reviewer sees that, they're going to be like, well, this isn't really relevant or good for AJPS or APSR. You might want to hit a good specialty journal over there in the corner, despite the fact that you've actually gotten the causal mechanisms better than anybody. And so you need to weigh out this relevant kind of balance between here's Northern Ireland, here's how it's similar to these other cases and therefore relevant, but here's how it's different and we might be concerned about that particular thing. But you need to have that transitional piece in there, and this is a reason for cutting out some of the other stuff so you can basically embed this within the broader literature. And there's the part of me that's kind of like, I think pieces that get the causal mechanism best or most accurate are pieces that are contributions that should be in the major journals. We haven't yet convinced the major journals that that's the case yet, because they're basically punting and going, yeah, you did get that, but you can't speak about the whole world, so get out of here, unless it's like the Holocaust or something like that, and then you can get away from kind of piece. Nothing against Jenny's piece, because I think that was great, but I'm noticing there's some biases in how the pieces that are individual and subnational and get at the deep kind of understandings a lot better. I'm noticing how they're getting reviewed, and we need to kind of push back against that, and a contextualization section that I think people are pushing for would be one way to get there. Respond, or that we can move.
Yeah, sure. I'm just going back a little bit here through my notes. Mike, I'm sorry I missed your comments, so I will go back and replay the video and listen to them. But my video was cutting out. In terms of looking at all the different types of violence and how they are associated, I did do that, and I did include in the models, other types of violence. I broke it down by groups, and what I was finding, for instance, that the British Army and the RUC, the differences weren't that great. So for me, it made sense to combine them, given that how many districts I had and how much data I had. So I did actually go back and do that a long time ago. But so maybe just being a little bit more clear about why I did what I did, or presenting the full results would be useful. Again, I thought about looking at interaction effects of the violence, so maybe that's somewhere sort of to take this. I guess this issue, I guess in the larger book project, I do have a chapter on the Basque region of Spain, and then a little bit on Lebanon and the Palestinian territories, and just thinking about how what we learn in Northern Ireland would apply there and wouldn't apply there. So again, I try to crunch that into the paper at the end. And I'm not sure if it's worth it. And going back to your point, Reyko, I'm not sure, I haven't, I've done some research, but I haven't looked at these things as closely, in Lebanon, for instance, as I did in Northern Ireland. And obviously the reason for that is just data availability and the number of elections and things like that. So part of me, I'm pretty confident saying, I believe what I believe about Northern Ireland, and I think these similar sorts of things may be going on in these other countries, but I'm not as convinced for them, so I don't know whether it's worth limiting or expanding, or just being, I guess, very clear about what I think does and doesn't hold. Let me see. I don't know if there's anything else. I don't know. That's about it for responses.
Bridgett, start typing. Oh, damn. Okay.
Whoa. Let's see.
Okay, while we're all reading, I'll read for the viewers. Voting for a paramilitary party may be drawing those who are previously disenfranchised into the political process, and that would be a positive for conflict resolution, or at least normal politics. Privileging normal, but whatever. On the other hand, it may be that those who are routinely voting for the other non-violence associated parties are now voting for those associated with SF, San Francisco? What are you talking about?
Sinn Féin.
Sinn Féin.
Yeah, Sinn Féin.
No, I hate acronyms. That's what I hate. I hate abbreviations. That's what I'm in the debate. It would be great to be able to identify which trajectory is operating. Your answer that voting is motivated by individual insecurity doesn't disentangle the two, but I think that it suggests that voting for Sinn Féin is a normatively bad thing. Is that right? What is the theory of voting behind it? Is it institutionalizing violence, or what is the big take-home for a wider conflict resolution? That's from Bridgett.
Yeah, I don't think it's normatively a bad thing. I think it's bad for, stability and things like that, but I don't think it's bad in the sense that it gives people a voice, right? Where they can say, I'm upset with what's happening, and I'm going to vote for this sort of competitor. So I don't think necessarily it's normatively a bad thing. In terms of disenfranchisement, I do look at turnout, and I do this a little bit more so in the larger, again, book manuscript, where I have a chapter looking at aggregate changes over time in Northern Ireland. And actually what you see is, so there's this sort of trend at the aggregate level, which runs counter to my hypothesis, and that's that as violence against civilians goes down in Northern Ireland, right, Sinn Féin's vote share goes up. And that's really driven a lot in part by the fact that the party expands to other electoral districts over time. So you actually see them hugely expand. And then also I explain it in terms of changes in state policy. So Reyko, getting to your point, I really do think these other things matter. You know, it's not just state violence, but for the purposes of this empirical analysis, I use state violence. So I do look at sort of this disenfranchisement. And interestingly, right, Sinn Féin, when they initially started running, they told people not to vote, right? So they told people to stay at home and not to vote, and then they realized, you know, oh, okay, we can actually get, you know, further by actually having people come out and register their displeasure, basically, by voting. So that's a great point, though. I'll think a little bit more about the normative implications. I'm not 100% sure yet.
Yeah, I'm always thrown by kind of pieces that are either highlighting like just what the state is doing or what the challengers are doing. I'm on this relative contention thing, right? I'm just like, and this gets actually back to, if you go back to the Civil War defection stuff, it matters. It matters what zone you're in, right? If you take that stuff, and thus that's the relative contention. That's governments relative to challengers, and so the conflict's not moving through space that much. So you do have a certain kind of like fixed element of it, but I would be more concerned with the ratio of violence being generated from the different sides as to how that affects what zone citizens would be in, and thus whether or not their votes are defection or support. And that I think would be useful to play out. And then also kind of like there's a lot of stuff about kind of like contiguity within the troubles and so forth, which would be, I mean, the N isn't huge, but I mean that would allow you to kind of sensitize some of this, because that might matter what's going on in the contiguous locations.
Yeah, no, so I tried to get at this sort of Kalivis argument by looking at, you know, who was basically, you know, whether more Catholics were being killed, or more, sorry, IRA members were being killed by the state security forces versus the other way around. But I think looking maybe at a ratio variable or something like that would be much more useful, or a better measure of that. I also wanted to get to Hannah's point. I missed on national elections. So for the national elections, you can only get 12. I mean, I can look at them, you know, but you can only get 12 really big districts, the constituencies. So I didn't look at them because they're just so large that I think it's hard to really say that, you know, the violence that's occurring all the way up here is affecting something down there. But it'd be worth it to look at and just see if the results are consistent or something like that.
Not to jump in on Hannah's point, but it seems like given the well-covered nature of the Troubles, it's clearly the case that people would be aware of violence even over a larger territory. So I still think your basic point could play out relatively well. But what people are thinking about what that vote means relative to the violence is the thing that I know that's the thing that I'm still kind of getting at. But it could be that localized violence affects local elections, and that's pretty reasonable. But then you do have, if you're going along with this electoral argument, why wouldn't broader violence have implications for even local elections? I think there's a sense of getting a general sense of where the conflict is throughout the whole conflict as it affects your local kind of voting behavior. But I don't see why you couldn't have larger aggregations affecting the relevant kind of constituency at that level and the electoral behavior at that level as well. And seeing where it breaks down. It might break down at a certain point, going up or down, and so maybe that's a separate paper. But to what degree it aggregates or disaggregates would be an empirical question.
Yeah,
I think
sorry,
my point was more just, you know, you sort of need to just tell us why you're looking at one or the other, because I'm going to wonder.
Yes. Yeah. No, I know. So so just being sort of more clear, and also I think with the constituencies there were some boundary changes, so it's harder. You can look, you know, across them, but it's harder to look over time. Because of those boundary changes. So you can't get data, for instance, for Westminster elections, you can't get them at the district electoral area level. They're only reported for the constituency, and then those boundaries change over time, so it just becomes, you know, really problematic. It would have been great if I could have looked at the same district electoral area and had different elections, but it's just not possible with the data that's available. So.
And hopefully the boundaries didn't change for political reasons, but yeah.
I couldn't hear. Something about boundaries.
Will.
Okay.
So I wanted to know, Mary Beth, what percentage of the fatalities have an unknown perpetrator?
I don't know off the top of my head, but most of it's very, very low. So it's very low. The biggest missing data is in locations. So
The location is bigger. The location of the fatality.
Yeah, the postcode location is actually there's more missing data for that, and most of it is for the earlier years. So by the 80s, they were much better sort of reporting where there was less violence, but also just better in terms of reporting where it was happening and things like that. So in terms of the purpose, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look. It's probably worth reporting to in the paper.
I think it's important to report both of them because, and then why, and then some sort of a reason why we shouldn't be concerned about, some sort of a reason why you think that's basically missing at random.
Okay,
right?
good. Yeah, no, that'd be great to put.
That was the issue that. It's very unusual for fatalities data to not just, have huge for 30, 40%, missing on that kind of information, which raises lots of concerns.
Yeah.
Plus,
no, it's nowhere near that.
For time, right? Which, so that was bouncing around my head. Another issue that nobody's raised, and I'm curious if I'm the only one. I'm just not buying the above versus below mean decision. I don't, and for me this is, you may have a story, and in fact it may have been in there and I just couldn't put it together, but you may have a story about why the process that you're concerned about with respect to endogeneity is going to actually generate above versus below the mean distinctions. But if so, I couldn't follow it. And it struck me as a convenient sort of, high levels would be different. And so there's at least one reader who felt that my takeaway was this felt arbitrary to me, and so whether that's a presentational or it really isn't that strong, I'm not sure. But I was wondering if you could, defend that decision a little bit, and maybe I can understand. Even though I didn't get it from the paper, I could understand from this.
Yeah, so it would be helpful to hear other people's, whether you think it's worth keeping in or scrapping. But basically, from everything I've observed, it seemed to be the case that, and even just thinking about it theoretically, right, the way you respond to sectarian violence, so state violence almost always seems, right, like it's going to generate this, if the states engage in these sort of, grotesque violations of human rights, and they're not being held accountable for them, right, then that's nearly always going to cause you to, right, perceive them as not providing or unable or unwilling to provide for your security, right? But sectarian violence I see a little bit differently. So for instance, in the US, right, we have sort of racial crime and other things going on, or interracial violence, hate crimes, and so the idea is that violence affects people's perceptions a little bit differently, to the extent that we believe that the state is actually, right, addressing those issues, right? They're not sort of implicit in them or complicit in them. So that's sort of what I was thinking theoretically. In terms of breaking it up, I think that the way that people sort of respond and react to violence, like sectarian violence, is already conditional on their sort of pre-existing notions of the state. And so I didn't have survey data to get at that, which would be the ideal, right? So if I had some sort of survey data about how people thought about the state and then how they reacted to sectarian violence. So the best I could do was just to sort of split it and say that people who live in these districts, right, one, they may have been exposed to more state violence because if my theory is true, right, Sinn Féin's already sort of, or the IRA is already operating there, but also they're exposed to propaganda. So if you look at the propaganda, which I don't have time to sort of go through, detail in the paper, but the IRA frames sectarian violence in a very particular way, and they pass out all these pamphlets and things like that. So you're exposed to the framing in a certain way if you live in those communities. Whereas if you're in sort of a moderate Catholic area, you're not getting all that propaganda and all of that, framing, and maybe your experience of the state is very different. So it's sort of trying to proxy for that. I agree it's
right there?
A little bit.
So is what you're arguing is that the above averages are the ones that are exposed to more messaging? In effect, that's correlated with, I mean, is that right? I mean, you presumably don't have a measure of the pamphleting, because that made some sense to me.
Yeah, I don't have a measure of it, but I mean, just from going through archives and seeing what communities things were passed out in, and how that played out at the community level. So that's what I'm trying to get at. I agree, like splitting it at the average is just arbitrary, but I was just trying to find a way to sort of proxy for that, absent any sort of survey data or anything like that, or data on pamphleting by communities or something like that.
What about? Do you have any data on IRA cells?
No, I don't. No, I mean, I don't have.
That's really what you're trying to get at, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't. I mean, I have data for it's very crude data on sort of their newspaper sales, which might be a sort of the best proxy I could think of in terms of because they would sell them where they were.
Sure.
But again, it's not sort of over time by year, by district. It's crude, and it's not at the level of these 78 districts, right? So I just don't know how to proxy it at that low district level.
Did you say? I didn't hear you.
You had it too. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. The point that I wanted to make, and what Will was talking about just reminded me of that. I'm very uncomfortable, just sort of as a introduction to that, I'm very uncomfortable with the cross-sectional, especially because I think it lacks all sorts of important, it has a very low end, and it lacks all sorts of important controls like prior vote share, so you have no baseline in a district for what you would expect the party to have. The table 3 and 4, on the other hand, I really liked, and I think that the reason I really liked them is because the first differences is very clear. Then you have a baseline, and then the above and the below, that is a story that comes straight out of the voting literature. I mean, that's Zoller. People that are already partisan, they are predisposed to take any message and sort of reinforce what they already believe. And so if you're sort of on the fence, but you tend to favor Sinn Féin and there's any violence whatsoever, you're going to use that as a reason to vote for them. And so I think that you can make a very convincing case for the above, and with a very strong electoral story.
Okay. I mean, do you think it's worth dropping or either improving the cross-sectional, putting in the variables you suggest, or just dropping it altogether?
I would drop it. I personally, given that you can do first differences, I mean, when Anita and I did a paper on Peru, we couldn't take first differences because there were so many shifts and changes between countries. First differences would have been my preference. Given that we couldn't do that, we did structural equations, and that's fine. But given that you can take first differences, I don't see any reason why you would do anything but, especially because your N is so low that you don't want to introduce all sorts of controls like prior vote share, which really, without prior vote share, you have no baseline and you really don't know. I mean, I don't believe those results at all, frankly. The first differences I do. And the first difference is in the first one, you don't have a relationship. But when you split it up, you do, and in a very believable way, in my opinion. So I would drop 2 and keep 3 and 4, and explain it in this way. You have districts where there's something different going on. There's either more messaging, or for some reason that population, or there's historically more violence or something. That population is predisposed, and so something happens, additional violence, and they jump over to Sinn Féin. They use the opportunity to take that message and jump over to support the party that they were predisposed to supporting anyway.
Great, thank you. That's great.
Will, are we at time? Very good. Everyone, thank you very much for joining this session of the Conflict Consortium. Mary Beth, thank you very much for the paper.
Well, thank you. This was great. Thank you so much for taking the time to read this and for your feedback. It was really, really valuable.
Very good. Will?
And Bridgett, you haven't actually failed at all. Thank you. You know, the technology sometimes is, you know, we try to make it our friend, but it isn't always. So thank you for sticking it out, even though you were literally muted, which is, you know. And if you have other comments that you want to send along that you didn't have a chance to raise, please feel free. Again, thank you for joining us on a holiday, and wish everybody have a great day.
You too.
King lives.